Welcome everyone to the panel. The title of the session is Funding Systems Change, What Can Doers and Donors Learn from Each Other? So if that is the panel that you're expecting to be a part of, you are in the right place. Our goal today is to have an honest, frank, unfiltered conversation about funding systems change. We want to gain some insights. We want to learn from each other, perhaps debunk some widely held assumptions about donors and doers. We want to understand some of the barriers to systems change work and to getting funding for that work. And hopefully we'll find some opportunities for collaboration in the midst of it. Our session is going to run about an hour and 15 minutes. And at a high level, it will include audience polls to gather some quick insights. We're going to engage you as the audience. We're going to do 2 rounds of questions to our fantastic panel. We're going to have a Q&A with the audience, so you and the audience will have a chance to ask questions of our panelists. And then we're going to close with a final word of advice from each of our panelists and some brief closing remarks. And by the close of our session, I am hopeful that we'll all have learned to broaden our perspective. We'll have maybe gained a few nuggets about funding systems change, and we'll leave inspired to build partnerships. So can we have the slide, please, on the agenda? There's our quick agenda. And I want to start by looking at the definition of systems change. So what do we mean by systems change? I think people often have different descriptions or definitions, and those differing descriptions sometimes lead to misunderstanding between and among donors and doers about systems change. But for today's conversation, we're going to be using the definitions you see on the screen. While they are somewhat different in wording, they're generally aligned in their description of the concept. We are fortunate today to have an accomplished panel that includes representatives from both the donor world and the doer world. And I'm thrilled to have the privilege to introduce them and to interact with them. I'm going to start by introducing myself, which I realize I haven't done. I'm Tim Hanstead, CEO of the Chandler Foundation. Many of you may know me as the co-founder and longtime leader of Landesa and a 2012 Skoll Social Entrepreneur Awardee. A year and a half ago, I moved from the doer world to the donor world. After 30 plus years working in the doer world, advocating for system change, land rights improvements, I took the challenge of applying what I'd learned in an effort to make philanthropy even more effective. And I got the opportunity to do that with the Chandler Foundation, which was established by Richard Chandler, a Singapore-based emerging markets investor and a longtime philanthropist. Richard Chandler is one of the founding core partners of Co-Impact, and our foundation is focused on supporting systems change efforts. We're funding social purpose organizations that work with governments, with business, with civil society on policies and programs in the global South that create the enabling conditions for all people to have an opportunity to prosper. On a personal note, I am the proud spouse of Chitra and proud father to 4 adult children. Chitra and I were just, have been talking lately about in the current environment, how different it would be if our children were young and active and at home. So my hat goes off to you moms and dads out there of younger kids who are juggling both of that in this time. But now on to our main attraction, our terrific panel. Again, 2 who are representing donors and 2 who are representing doers. First, the donors. It's my pleasure to introduce Olivia Leland, CEO of Co-Impact. Olivia has 20 years of experience in philanthropy and government in the social purpose sector. She is the founding CEO of Co-Impact. She's also a senior vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation. Previously, Olivia served as the founding director of the Giving Pledge. And Olivia lives with her husband and 3 young children in London, where Olivia tells me they are presently enjoying 2 new augmented reality pets, a giant panda and a penguin. Thanks, Olivia, for introducing me to augmented reality pets. Next, to Sophia. Sophia Mikalakis. Sophia leads the Giving Pledge now. Her overarching goal in this role is to create a new set of assumptions around wealth and giving that will become regarded as the norm. Sophia also serves as a deputy director on the philanthropic partnerships team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She is the board chair for Social Venture Partners International and previously worked as the director of philanthropy development at Social Venture Partners Seattle. In addition to enjoying habitat restoration projects, Sophia tells me that she and her family are a little obsessed with costumes, board games, and scavenger hunts, which sounds very fun. Moving from donors to doers, we're thrilled to have Cheryl Dorsey. Cheryl is the president of Echoing Green. She's a pioneer in the social entrepreneurship movement, an award-winning social entrepreneur herself, and now leads an organization that works with social entrepreneurs, I think 30 fellows per year. Echoing Green's also building a better ecosystem for social entrepreneurship. Cheryl has served 2 U.S. presidential administrations as a White House fellow, as a special assistant to the U.S. Secretary of Labor, and has received numerous awards for her public service, including the Robert Kennedy Distinguished Service Award. Cheryl, like me, loves tennis. And even now in this current era, she's playing 3 to 4 days a week, social distancing, 78 feet away from her opponent, while channeling 2 of her heroines, Serena and Venus Williams. And last but not least, Jeru Billamoria. Jeru, the way to introduce Jeru is to read directly from the description of her on the Skoll website. The founder of several innovative and award-winning NGOs, Jeru encapsulates what it means to be a social entrepreneur. She is a Skoll awardee, an Ashoka and Schwab Fellow, and is considered among the world's leading change makers. So Jeru has more than 20 years experience starting and running change organizations. She was recently a driving force, along with Cheryl, behind the founding of Catalyst 2030, which we'll hear more about later. Jeru lives in the Netherlands, where she and her family love to cook together and have long dinner conversations followed by music and games. In fact, I understand her children are busy right now cooking dinner for her, which she'll enjoy after we finish today. Jeru has boundless both energy and humility, a rare combination. And we are so lucky to have you, Jeru, and all of you panelists. So you out there in the audience, now you know the panelists, now we want to get to know you. So we have a poll question for you. Are you a doer, a donor, or a doer? And so please select whether your current primary day job is primarily in the donor world or primarily in the doer world. Try to select one of the two. For those of you who can't select because you're equally split, we do give the option of selecting both. And we are waiting for the poll results, seeing them in progress. Can one of our panelists hum the Jeopardy tune here? Okay, the votes are coming in. We do have a good mix, it looks. We've got our panelists, are everyone seeing the results in progress? No. Okay, I'll describe them to you. So we still have some more time coming. It looks like of the almost 300 people who voted, 58% are doers, are 27% donors, and 16% have said both. So thank you. Good to know who's out there. And let's jump to the panel questions. Let's start with Olivia. Olivia, you have a rather unique position as a leader of a donor collaborative that both provides support for systems change efforts, but you're also actively seeking other donors to join those efforts. So I'm sure in that latter role that you're finding that not every donor you talk to is necessarily interested in supporting systems change. What are some of the common reasons that you hear from those who prefer not to support systems change efforts?
Sure. First of all, it's wonderful to be here with you, Tim, and with this panel, and with all of you. So thank you for inviting me. So I think exactly as you said, Tim, I don't think that it is the norm for donors actually to be focused on systems change, which will be not a surprise to anybody here. Although there is a growing number of donors who are focused on it. I think really there are two reasons why people tend not to focus on it. One, which is a desire for control, because ultimately, and I know we'll talk more about what we mean by systems change, but ultimately it does need to be really driven by the actors that are closest to the work and that are then working in coalition with government and with others to be able to do this. So it can't be really driven by philanthropy. Philanthropy can be only one of the actors. And so it's that need to sort of trust and to be able to kind of take that step back and say, how can I as a funder really be supportive of this group of actors and give up some control in doing that. So I think that can sometimes be tough, also because it does mean that it's harder sometimes to see immediately what the impact is, although really can see the results. So I think on the plus side, and the reason I think people really do get engaged is the fact that the impact can be enormous. And so that's, I think, what gets people hooked in realizing what the possibilities are there. So I think that's one piece. The other is the complexity of it. I think it can sometimes, I was actually just talking to a funder the other day who said, I just prefer to fund things that are simpler, which I do think is something that we find. And so I think our job as well for all of us is to try to, while recognizing its complexity, also figure out how to engage people on kind of what does this mean and what are the pieces to really try to understand, and to the report, which I imagine Drew will be talking about, to embrace the complexity as well.
Great, thanks, Olivia. And Olivia, what are some of the funding practices that Co-Impact has adopted that are system change friendly?
So I'll speak to a few of them. I think the first one is making sure, and this is fundamental to how we seek to work, so hopefully we live up to that, which is to be program partner centered, which basically means to ensure that our job as the funder is to be supportive of our program partners and to try to basically accompany them in doing this work. It goes back to the piece that as a funder of systems change, it's really about trying to figure out how you can recognize that you're one actor in this, and that ultimately it needs to be driven by the coalition that's actually really closest to the work. So I think that's one. The second is the nature of our funding is longer term and larger, which I think also just in order to give this the space for the organizations to have strategic coherence that's required in order to do this work. So it's not about kind of piece by piece, but it's about having a vision for what can happen at a systems level. So being able to have kind of that longer vision, which as we know, a lot of funding tends to come in kind of 1 and 3 year chunks. And so figuring out sort of how to provide, so our funds are 1 year upfront and then 5 years in the systems change grants, and then also to try to bring on more significant funding. And then I guess I would say that an additional piece is actually trying to make sure that that as we work with our partners, that we're also thoughtful about within the system ensuring that the voices are really heard. So we take, so one of the key things is really thinking about gender across everything that we do, and really again, supporting our partners in getting feedback from the communities as well, since that's so important in terms of keeping an eye on how the systems change is actually playing out. So those are a few of them.
Great, thank you. Sophia, so in many of the discussions in the writing about ultra high net worth philanthropists, they appear to be labeled and treated as a rather homogenous group. So has that been your experience, or are they as diverse in their motivations and approach as doers are? What are the differences that you see, if any, and what are maybe commonalities?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to join this wonderful panel, and really a big shout out to the Skoll World Forum for adapting and making this available online so that so many more people can access, discussions like this. So really pleased to be here. I won't speak for all of the ultra high net worth donors out there, but let me just talk a little bit about the Giving Pledge specifically, which has over 200 individuals and couples who have signed, and what they all have in common is they're committed to giving the majority of their wealth to philanthropic causes in their lifetime or in their will. So they have that common commitment that they've made, but within that group of over 200, there are quite a lot of differences. We see huge range in the ages. We have folks in their early 30s up to their early to mid 90s. So that's big difference there across the board. And people are at very different stages in life along that age range. Some people are actively running businesses, others are mostly retired. The causes pledgers can support are really any philanthropic cause. So that's another big area of range. And the time horizon people set for their giving. Some are committed to giving while living, famously like Chuck Feeney, and others have much longer term horizon for their philanthropic giving, even in perpetuity, like David Rockefeller, one of the early signers. Some involve their family, some have no children or don't involve their family in their giving, and they have a variety of structures and vehicles for their giving. Some have 0 staff and are doing it completely on their own, and others have large teams. So lots and lots of differences across the group. But there are also commonalities, and I'll point out a few. There's a really high percentage of Giving Pledge signatories who are self-made. They're kind of first generation ultra high net worth. And so many of them really think about the money that they've amassed as not necessarily belonging to them, in a sense that many of them have this common value around sharing the good fortune they've had, and talk a lot about having been very, very lucky, not having expected to come into so much wealth. Concerns about the impact of leaving a vast fortune on their children, since many of them didn't grow up very wealthy, and so they really see philanthropy as the obvious choice for them. A lot of them speak of young experiences watching parents give at great sacrifice, and feel very connected with that value of supporting communities and being part of that, and just see that as the right thing to do. Among the causes, I mentioned there's a range. There are certainly some areas that receive a lot more attention across pledgers, education being one, health being another, and a really growing interest in climate change that we're seeing over especially the last 5 years. The other thing that might be a surprising commonality among this group is that most of them are fairly private. They're just not looking for massive attention to them, particularly around their wealth or their giving. They don't want to appear to be like looking for attention as givers. And so that's probably the biggest thing that people have to overcome in deciding to join the Giving Pledge, is that they are putting themselves out there publicly as making this commitment. But the desire for learning, which is so common to this group, and becoming smarter, better givers, and seeing the need to learn from others and what approaches have been effective and what mistakes people have made along the way, so that they can have greater impact in their giving, is just a huge commonality in this group.
Thanks, Sophia. Jeroen. We've already heard you're a great example of a systems change entrepreneur. I know you get embarrassed by me saying that, but you've helped to catalyze, to lead, to galvanize several broad multi-stakeholder coalitions that have achieved social impact at scale by changing systems. Give us a quick example maybe of an effort that achieved systems changing impact, and what were the key success factors, first from an implementation perspective? You're on mute.
Sorry. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. So as you know, I've done several organizations. I'll start with the one which actually addresses what Sophia was saying, and how you can make things very simple but also change systems. So one of my first organizations, the third one that I started, was Childline India, and that's as simple as it gets. It's a phone service for kids, and it first started as a phone service for street kids by street kids. And we could have grown, but of course the dream was to go national, and there was not enough money to make that happen. So we piloted it with street kids. No one believed that we would be able to have a toll-free number for kids. And then realizing that we had to bring about the change, we kept the service element, but started partnering with the government, the telecom sector, the corporate sector, everybody. And by doing that, we were able to A, leverage a lot of actors to make this happen, and B, which to me is more important, was actually influence the child protection system in India. Because then we were able to tell the government, see, we are getting so many calls for domestic child labor. You need to change the domestic child labor law. See what is happening with adoption. You need to intervene over here for global adoption. There is no money. So by doing this, by partnering with the government, we were able to change laws for child protection. We got in a whole integrated child protection policy. We were able to open centers at railway stations, so you get the problem right at the start. So what I'm trying to say over here is, you can keep things simple, you can do the practice that you have to, but at the same time you can work with the government to bring about the change that is necessary. So the impact of your work is much more. Today, Childline India responds to 15 million calls. Child Helpline International close to 150 million phone calls. And that is a huge amount, but it's the same thing. And I say the secondary impact is far greater, because the amount of money which has gone into child protection policies because of child helplines, the child protection systems which have improved, that is where the real change is coming. And that is what we need to look at. So I took the Childline India model and we took it global, and we have child helplines which were there in Europe, but in developing countries now in 156 countries. And we follow the same model. And so what I'm trying to say is, if you take systems change right when you start your project, and if you are able to work with the donors to get them to see that you have to make this happen, you'll be able to catalyze change faster. I always say these are my 5 things which I've learned over the years. You know, I have lots of gray hair. Is if you have to actually start something, take people along. So every project in systems change, it will start maybe as an implementation project, but you need to co-create it together with all the stakeholders. Never ever take the lead. I always believe in this role of honest broker, that if you have to bring about systems change, you have to play the role of the honest broker. That means stay in the background as much as possible. The other principles I think are followed much more often, which is convening, be it virtual, like with Skoll, or however, convening, connecting, celebrating successes. So I think that's important. And the last is measuring your impact, because if you have put measuring impact right from the way you want it and not how your donor wants it right from the beginning, you're able to scale faster. So these are some of the things which I have seen have worked in a nutshell.
Thanks, Drew. It's great to get your lessons from your experience. And I want to come back to you later, Jeru, because I know that from previous discussions with you that you've been able to achieve some of these things with these larger coalitions without necessarily getting funding that is system change friendly. And so we're going to come back to you and ask you later what were the implications of that for the efforts. But let's move to Cheryl. Cheryl, I imagine that most of our audience is aware of Echoing Green's great work in finding and supporting early stage entrepreneurs, but they may be less familiar with your mission of building a dynamic ecosystem that supports those leaders. So how does our session topic today relate to Echoing Green's mission, and what are you doing to help donors and doers implement and support system changing efforts?
Sure, and thanks, Tim, for taking on the work of moderating the session, and I'm thrilled to be joined by this incredible group of panelists, and appreciate everyone from joining in from wherever you find yourself in this world, and I hope you are safe and your family is safe. So thank you so much. So from Echoing Green's perspective, I guess we fall in the category of the doers, a community of doers. But for those of you who don't know Echoing Green, we really sort of sit within the social innovation movement at the intersection of innovation and justice. So our work has been very much predicated on sort of the foundational work of social movements. And in fact, we actually think systems change, nomenclature work, and a lot of the processes that are springing up are in some ways just sort of social movement methodology by another name. And as we think about social movements, we sort of define them as sort of these organized challenges to authority and power that use a broad range of tactics, both inside and outside of conventional politics, all in an effort to promote positive social and political change. So from where we sit, we mostly invest in social entrepreneurs who've got a movement-based, a justice-based approach to doing the very hard work of social change. And we've sort of recognized and watched and learned of how that unfurls on the ground in community. So I'll start by saying, you know, a lot of the organizations in which we invest that are deeply ensconced in the work of social change, systems change, you can sort of see sort of four precursors that often show up in these organizations along their path to achieving real long-term improvements. There's sort of the enhancement of the knowledge of these organizations. They're learning organizations. Secondly is the very important work of expanding their capacity. And that's, you know, work like Olivia and her team do around co-impact. There's the work of strengthening relationships in community and beyond community, sort of forging greater social capital. And then sort of the all-important notion of deepening community ownership. Because again, at the end of the day, this is about building power and proximate power. And then what happens once you do this, and you've got these sort of precursors that are in place and that are building the momentum of these organizations, you end up with sort of the necessary conditions that allow systems change efforts to take root and build better local systems. And you start to see things like the transformation of norms within organizations and in these communities and new ways of working. There's the stuff that you would normally think of, sort of the organizational shifts that happen all along the way of scaling and sustaining new practices and policies. There's always, of course, the very hard work of implementing supportive regulatory, legislative, and public policies. And last but not least, a lot of this work, and I think this is a topic why a lot of folks dialed in today, is how do you start thinking about the reallocation of funding streams or sort of the uptake of new funding streams. So from the perspective of working with organizations on the ground, that's how this process happens. Increasingly, Echoing Green through its field building and ecosystem work is how do you work with leaders, mainly proximate leaders, women, people of color, who confront a whole host of structural barriers, barriers to capital, barriers to access to key networks that don't allow them to fully engage in the systems change work that they're trying to achieve. So increasingly, we're focusing on how do you name and then dismantle some of those structural barriers, starting with the barriers to capital. We've been working with the Bridgeband Group over the course of the past year to interview, dig deep within our longitudinal data set to get our arms around that question about access to capital barriers and how to start to dismantle those. And later this week, Bridgeband and Echoing Green will be in conversation. So happy to share with the group more about that. But that's how we think about systems change.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. I want to take a break now and engage the audience a bit. We have a poll question for you, and this will require a little bit of instruction because we're going to ask the same question first to donors and then later to doers. So the question you'll see on the screen, what do you perceive as the most important reason why donors might be reluctant to support systems change efforts? And it's a multiple choice question. So first for donors, because we want to compare the differences between the donors and doers and how you perceive this. So if we could pull up the actual poll question that the audience can interact with. There you are. Okay, so this is from a donor perspective. So you doers don't answer yet. You'll get a chance, but think about how you're going to answer, and we'll give about 15 more seconds for the donors to reply here. Still have votes coming in. Okay, 5 more seconds. Get your vote in if you're a donor. Okay, thank you, donors. So we had about 100 of you reply. And let's go to the doers now and give the doers a chance to reply or to take the poll. So if we could please put up the same question and have the doers in the audience reply. Okay, here we go. From a doer perspective. So doers, now you can reply. Okay. Are people able to answer? Here we go. There you go. Okay. So votes are coming in from doers on the most important reason why donors might be reluctant to support systems change efforts. Okay, we're going to give you about 10 more seconds. Still have votes coming in. Looks like the 2 top answers are about difficulty in attribution and shorter timelines, at least so far. Great. Let's close the polling. And we're going to come back and look at those answers and maybe compare them. Oh, here, we got them right here. So this is from a doer perspective. The top answer had to do with the difficulty in attribution. The second was shorter term timelines, followed by building the necessary coalitions, the difficulty of that. 21% said that donors lack understanding about systems change. Can we show the poll results from the donor side? I think that's from the doer side. We may not be able to do that. We may have to come back to it later, and that's okay. Okay, let's go to a second round of questions now to the panelists. Back to Olivia. So as systems change becomes, at least in our world, maybe an increasingly popular term, if not part of the zeitgeist, I find that there are many organizations, social purpose organizations out there that are trying to portray their work as systems changing when maybe it's not systems changing, and which, by the way, is okay not to be systems changing. Do you experience this at Co-Impact? And if so, what does it reveal about potentially common misunderstandings about systems change, or at least the way that Co-Impact defines systems change?
Sure. And first, just a quick comment. That was fascinating to see the poll. So I'm eager to come back to that, since I do think this point of attribution is such an interesting one, because it goes to attribution specifically as to what the donor has particularly funded, but there really are ways to be able to track and see the results at a systems level, at people level, and organizational level. So anyway, but that's not your question, sorry. I guess, and just as Tim, you know this, and Cheryl, since you were involved, thank you very much, key in this phase of development and Co-Impact. But basically, before I started Co-Impact, I spent a year partially funded by the Skoll Foundation to speak to hundreds of people, mostly social change leaders around the world, to say, really, what would you like to see philanthropy do better? And one of the key things that came out of that was exactly the topic of this discussion, which is be better constructed to really support systems change. And a lot of the things that each of the panelists has mentioned around what's required to do that. I think the big challenge here, and the reason why sometimes it's harder to do this, is that actually so little funding is really designed in such a way as to support systems change, that it's very hard, if you're running an organization, to have the space and time to be able to build the necessary coalitions and partnerships, and to be doing this movement building that Cheryl was talking about, and to have that space with longer term funding, with the complement, with the kind of connections that funders can also help provide in terms of coalition building, etc. And so I think that is one of the sorry, child. One of the particularly important things is to think about kind of what, as a funder, what can the funding community actually do to support this. So I think, directly to your question, one of the biggest things that we find is that because people generally haven't had the space and time to say, what could we really do to make our work really about systems change, it often does tend to be more about scaling one's own work and scaling one's own organization. And so a key thing is figuring out how we can create the space for that, which is in part, that's the reason that we actually provide the upfront design phase funding, which is to basically say, what else do we need to do to really support the development of a full systems change plan, and to really focus on, yes, the partnership building, recognizing political economy, trying to kind of build out what's required in order to do this work effectively.
Great. Thanks, Olivia. I want to go to Sophia and make the observation that I think some people perceive that ultra high net worth donors progress through stages of kind of philanthropic awareness and practices, and those stages are kind of gradually becoming more aware and more sophisticated until they reach a sophistication pinnacle that includes a primary focus on systems change efforts. Has that been your observation? Do philanthropists typically go through those stages, and is systems changing efforts kind of the pinnacle?
Well, thanks for that question. I'll give a non-scientific answer, just based on observation as you asked. I mean, I've seen some donors definitely come to that recognition after years of working in a particular cause, for example, that, you know, they just see that philanthropy is not solving the problem, and they realize, like, hey, I really need to get a greater awareness of root causes and think about the systems at play here, and what role I as a donor could be in a more systemic solution. So some of them, I think, after years of experience, do do see that because they care deeply about a problem. And I've seen that through giving pledgers as well as through the other donor network I'm part of, Social Venture Partners. But I wouldn't call it necessarily a linear path, because I do see people actually start out their journey as donors, sometimes very interested right at the outset at systems level work. And then some who can be at something working in areas for decades who don't find it compelling or don't want to get involved in systems change. So I wouldn't call it a linear path. I think for some it is, for others it's a never, and some it's where they start.
Great. We, I'm told, have now, we can show you the poll results kind of side by side from doers and donors. So if our great team behind the curtain can show those. And I would just, I guess, invite the panelists to jump in here, anyone who wants to make observations, and at least initial observations about these poll results. Drew, you're on mute.
How do I keep it? Tim, if I may, if that's okay. I think I agree that sometimes it can be difficult to attribute outcomes and impact, but I think if we work systematically right from the beginning, it is actually, like Olivia said, relatively simple to be able to do it. Giving a very concrete example, just as an example, and I know several others, when we started my last to last organization, Child and Youth Finance International, we were working with governments and telling them to introduce economic citizenship education in the school curriculum. And but we wanted to see whether that would happen, it would not happen, and where it would go. So we actually worked with McKinsey to create a country-based 10-point diagnostic on how we were able to do it step by step by step. And what we were able to show was a direct correlation between the interventions which were put in and the outcomes at the country level. I say this because very often when we first went to donors, and when funding systems change is almost impossible, but when we even talked to people about it, they were like, it's not going to work. And we were able to prove this, and we were able to do it. So I think it's a myth, not a myth, it's difficult, but quite easy if we put a thinking cap on to calibrate things and to be able to take it. Because then with systems change, what isn't here and I think is important is we can also say that we have reached our maximum impact and now we need to move out. Like CYFI did, we handed it over to all the main players. So I think this is something important with point 3, which we need to look at. That's my 2 bitter.
Thanks, Drew. Any of the other panelists want to comment on the results? Any surprises in there?
Well, I guess a comment I'd have is they're actually fairly consistent, which is nice to see. You know, that obviously there are differences between the two groups, but there's also a lot of consistency there. I would just pick up on the shorter term timelines, which is, I think donors and doers sort of saw that one a little bit differently. And I would kind of underscore what I think the doers are seeing, that donors do prefer that shorter timelines. And I've observed that as well, that is a factor that a lot of donors have. And I think it's really worth a very open conversation with donors about the time horizon and how, you know, for whatever your initiative is, being very open about that, and also underscore what Jeru said earlier, like celebrating successes along the way can be also a way to keep your donors motivated for that long-term impact you're working on, and find those places where you can see progress along the way, even though your long-term impact, you may be years away from it. How are you seeing that? And also prepare donors for setbacks. There won't be success probably at every stage, but you know, how you can be seeing the long time horizon and making that progress over time.
Great, thanks, Sophia. So interesting results, and I also I was a bit surprised that they're as similar as they are. I guess it should be encouraging to the doers out there that fewer donors than doers, a fewer percentage see the short-term timeline as a barrier. I want to direct another question to Cheryl, though. Cheryl, this is about impact investing. So we've been talking mostly about philanthropy and philanthropic grants, but you've been involved in building the impact investing ecosystem. And so for those impact investors in our audience, what are their opportunities to support systems changing efforts?
Thanks, Tim. I don't think I'm going to answer this the way you want, Tim, so I'm going to answer it the way that I want. But I think it will be useful. I was the two polls were so interesting to me, and the fact that there seemed to be some agreement with donors and doers around the difficulty and attribution of outcomes and impact. And that's actually what I wanted to talk about, because I think that point is really important. And I think both those who care about impact investing as a way to direct capital to ventures that are expected to yield social and environmental benefits as well as profits is an important lane of the conversation, along with those that are focused on social impact first. Sort of this notion of how do you take sort of the guesswork out of measurement and evaluation, and how do you bring some rigor to measurement standards. And I'll give you sort of two examples of how I've been engaged on both the nonprofit side and for-profit side. In the first term of the Obama administration, I was one of many volunteers that helped stand up the White House Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation. And perhaps one of the things that the office was best known for was the creation of the Social Innovation Fund program, which was really a program that combined public and private resources to really grow promising community-based solutions. But the key was that it was community-based solutions that had evidence of results in the areas that the Obama administration was focused on: economic opportunity, healthy futures, and youth development. So key to it was not just sort of the selection and funding of these community-based programs, but the entity and initiative focused on providing the necessary evaluation resources to determine their impact, and really sort of did draw on some of the best practices in venture philanthropy, and the idea of, could you provide greater investments in nonprofit capacity to yield better results. So sort of really committing to an evaluation framework was really important. And I do think there's a comparable example in the impact investing space when you look at the work that the RISE Fund has done, and that's the TPG RISE Fund. They worked over the course of a couple of years with the Bridgespan Group to develop a methodology to really bring both the rigor of financial performance measurement as well as assessment of social and environmental impact of the investments that they were making. And the idea was, could you unlock more investment and more capital by really tapping into research and information about what social and environmental interventions work, and then use that data to project the good outcomes socially and environmentally that could lead to impact on both the financial front as well as SROI. So the importance of good, rigorous evaluation, I think, is really key to this conversation, but I know that Olivia and her team think hard about this all the time.
Great. Thanks, Cheryl. And I did like the way you answered the question, by the way.
Okay.
We are going to want to take some questions from the audience now. And we've received many questions. And just to say that I apologize in advance, we're not going to be able to answer all of your questions given the limited time, and given that I think we have about 350 people out in the audience, and many of them are asking questions. We will do our best as the organizers. I can't speak for the panelists, who are all very, very busy people, to try to get answers to you after the fact if we don't get to them now. We had a few questions come in before we even started. So I want to start with one of those. And this one's actually directed, well, I'm going to direct it to Olivia, or to Sophia. The question's about what are the opportunities for peer-to-peer learning among donors about systems change? And does the Giving Pledge offer such opportunities to the signers?
Yeah, thanks. You know, we're not obviously exclusively focused on systems change. We have, gosh, over time, I mean, I mentioned in the beginning the interest in learning. So we have peer learning opportunities that go deep onto both the hows of philanthropy, like approaches to philanthropy, and also topic areas. So about once a quarter, we'll have a deep learning full day or day and a half session on a particular topic. They're hosted by signatories with expertise in a particular area. And then throughout the year, in addition to those longer sessions, we have a number of smaller, you know, might be more like roundtable, people in similar roles, or salon dinners, or things that can kind of continue the conversation after we've gone deep on a topic to continue to engage people in the conversation. And there have been a number of systems change topics in our group. If you go to givingpledge.org, there's a video section where we put highlights from past learning sessions. So Liz Simons hosted a learning session on education using a systems change lens. Laura and John Arnold hosted one on criminal justice that was very systems change focused. Nick and Leslie Hanauer on advocacy and policy and how to do that well, and used 3 case studies from their work where they've used systems change and advocacy. So there have been a number of deep learning engagements that have taken a systems approach. And I just mentioned a couple of things just for the conveners out there and those of you in donor networks that, you know, one of the, I think, strengths of the peer-based learning that we sort of take seriously and I think is replicable in other groups is just the power of having your donors champion with other donors. And so when advice comes from a peer, it can be heard very differently and in a way that's really powerful for influencing others. And, you know, I think about hearing Laura Arnold talk to a group of Giving Pledge members and say, you know, systems change work, communities have solutions, communities know what they need. We need to prioritize what communities are saying, and that needs to come first. So, you know, having someone like that influencing her peers, sharing it is, you know, just a really powerful thing. So that's one example. And then another is kind of being able to show the vision for what the long-term systems change is going for. I thought it was really powerful when Liz Simons hosted her learning session around education systems change to take donors into a school district that had had 15 years of equitable funding at the state level and in an urban, poor public school district, you know, area. Because sometimes people just don't believe that the result will happen. And so to see at least like a place where this is working and get people to see that and get excited about it helps people believe that, hey, if this can happen here, this could happen anywhere. So those are just sort of 2 takeaways that I just would offer the group.
Great, thank you, Sophia. There's a question about the outcomes and impact and measuring that of course was one of the top answer, and that Cheryl just commented on about the importance of this. So it's a question which actually is a statement, but I'll try to pose it as a question. Both the doers and the donors are concerned about outcomes and impact, yet it seems virtually impossible to obtain funding specifically geared on research to measure impact. Anybody want to comment on that, on the difficulty? We all agree that this is really important, but why is it so difficult to get the funding necessary to do it?
Can I talk about funding in general?
Sure.
If that's okay? And the difficulty of obtaining funding for systems change work. So sorry, I'll get back to that in a larger way, but you know, you asked me to speak some of the organizations that I did in the past, but one of the things I'm doing now, I'm working on with close to 180 of the world's leading social entrepreneurs, 80 of them extremely active. And across the board, they all came together to form something called Catalyst because of the lack of funding for systems change. We do know that for systems change, you need evidence. But when there is no money, sorry, I'm cutting in over here quite bluntly. When we do know that there is almost no money for systems change work, then there is no money. So what every entrepreneur, if they have to really do systems change, have to take it from their program budget. And then of that program budget, they have to cull out even more money to do impact, because every donor asks for impact, but there is almost no money for it. And the reason I'm saying this is because if we have to bring about true systems change, we have to bring about true collaborations and dialogues. And that's what the social entrepreneurs want. And that's why they have co-created Catalyst, which is a network. Tim, you're a member. Tim wears both hats. That's why we love him, you know, because he can get the entrepreneur perspective to the donors and get the donor perspective back to us. So my request over here, Tim, is yes, impact is a very important part which doesn't get funded, but systems change work per se doesn't get funded. And so what would be really nice is if we could look at coming together, working. This is an open invitation to all the donors in the group who are listening also, coming together to see how we can co-create and work together to bring about true systems change. And Catalyst is a platform which was created by social entrepreneurs, is being managed by social entrepreneurs, but to just prove the point, is still not funded after being 9 months in existence. So it's a point to say that we talk about systems change. This is something trying to change the ecosystem, but not getting funding. Sorry, I took a bit long, but I think it was an important point to make. Otherwise, we were being very polite. So apologies.
Love it. No, thanks, Jeru. And Catalyst 2030 it's really impressive, the energy that's gotten behind that, and thanks to Jeru and Cheryl and many, many others who are working on it. Panelists, are you seeing questions coming in that you particularly want to answer that jump out to you? I just want to give some room for that opportunity. If not, I've got others. Okay, there's a break. So I'm Olivia.
I'll just jump in on one because just 2 points. One, and they're both somewhat related. So I also wanted to build on what Jeru was saying. So for those who don't know us, as Co-Impact, we fund systems change in the areas of education, health, and economic opportunity, and it's a collaborative of funders who do that. And so there was a question around how specifically we fund locally led organizations in doing that. And I just wanted to put a finer point on this. Cheryl spoke a little bit about this as well, but the importance of really supporting organizations and leaders that are actually, as Cheryl put it, proximate, but really finding leaders who have that deep understanding of the system is so important in terms of the nature of this work. So actually for our current round of funding, which is open now, so just wanted to make sure if anyone is looking for funding in the area of systems change and wants to know about this, we've actually extended our deadline, so it's an open call that's open through the end of April now. So we expanded it a month because of COVID-19. So So all the information is on our website, but one thing I just wanted to flag about that it is the anchor organization needs to be Global South led, and also we're looking especially for women-led organizations within that, and again across our different areas. So I think one of the key things is actually really finding organizations that are that have that understanding, and then we'll also work with other organizations. One of the things we grapple with as an organization is also, because of the scale of the funding, figuring out how do we also work with some of the and support the more grassroots organizations too. It's something we're continuing to look at and learn more about, is sort of how do we do that most effectively, and find the organizations, and oftentimes it's through these coalitions and ensuring that. So something that I think is a really important question I want to make sure to.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. Cheryl, were you trying to jump in here with an answer to a question?
No, I was just following up on Jeru's part. And again, you know, you should not put my name in the same sentence with Jeru. When Jeru tells you to do something, you do it. So I was thrilled to join the Catalyst 2030 Coalition, because I think her vision and the effort of collective action is so powerful. And I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention sort of the scale proposition of how, you know, you sort of think about the cross-cutting issues of systems change and collective action at scale. And I will point you to the Schwab, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but the Schwab Foundation did an impact study when they looked at 130 of the social entrepreneurs that they were working with. And that group was collectively reaching over 660 million people, sort of providing supports across a variety of the SDGs. And I thought that was such a powerful articulation of the collective strength of these groups, who individually and also collectively are focused on systems change efforts and sort of structural intervention. So I just wanted to add that to Jeru's point.
Thank you. Thank you. Very important point. Well, we committed to finishing up by 11:15, and in order to do that, we're going to have to transition into some closing questions. Again, I apologize to those in the audience whose questions we couldn't get to, and we'll do our best as organizers to try to answer those offline later. But I have a closing question for all four panelists, and they're different for the doers than they are for the donors. And I'm just going to ask you to quickly, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, give me an answer. First, for the doer. So the questions, this for Jeru and Cheryl. Question is, if you could change the mind of a donor to support systems change, what is your best argument for doing that? I'm going to start with Jeru. You're on mute, Jeru.
2 words I said: greater impact. Honestly speaking, that's it.
And in
You'll
terms,
be able to help more people, get in more money, get in more resources.
great. Well, you've been very brief, but let me quickly follow up. Thinking about the answers to the questions on what the barriers are, anything you'd want to say about any of those perceived barriers?
Was that for Olivia or me? I couldn't. I think the main barrier, all of them I'd say are perceived barriers, because if you talk like we are doing now, and if you have a lot of open dialogue, we'd be able to break down all the barriers. So my one thing is, let's talk, let's dialogue, and let's co-create. Come on, let's do it in Catalyst with all the other social entrepreneurs. That would be my.
Thanks, Jeru. Cheryl, if you could change the mind of a donor to support systems change, what do you think are the best, most effective arguments?
Yes, so I will harken back to my college days. I was a historian. I studied history of science. So I'm a true believer that past is prologue. And we all know that we really do live in an era of unique human progress. We've made progress against so many maladies in the world, but we also know that severe inequities and inequalities continue to exist that disadvantage billions of people around the world. And alongside those inequities, you've got these looming existential threats from climate change and even sort of the ongoing thing we've got to think about now, like life in an era of pandemics. And those realities are born of systems and the way that systems impact all of us. So recognizing that, you know, structurally, if we're going to sort of create and envision and imagine our way out of this current moment, you can't do this work without thinking about a systems change mindset. So it feels truly existential and important for all of us and all of you who have children, that this is the work of the world to do, and we've got to do it collectively. But that mindset of how do we create a more just economic, political, social system that is sustainable, that is equitable, that is inclusive, really is just critical to how we proceed in this moment.
So well said, Cheryl. Thank you. So to Olivia and Sophia, the question, you're representing the donors to the world here. If you could offer one piece of advice to doers who are seeking systems change on how they can best approach donors or attract the needing funding support, what would it be? Olivia, why don't you go first?
So I think this might not be entirely answering your question, but I think the biggest thing is really about continuing to influence donors, because as I mentioned earlier, and as I think a number of us mentioned, the real challenge here is that the number of funders that actually do fund systems change is still tiny. And so figuring out how, certainly what we're focused on at Co-Impact, which is actually bringing together funders that really are focused on systems change to say, what is it that we're learning? What are we seeing? How do we do this more effectively? How do we bring a beginner's mind to this and recognize that we don't have all the answers, but also really support this work? I think what I would love to see is actually more and more both of the organizations and of the funders being able to talk about what is it. It goes back to what Drew said, which is this is actually about driving more impact. And so to the extent that we can actually show that and show what these results are, it goes to some of the other things that we talked about here, and say, this is why. It's not an abstract concept. Oftentimes when I talk to people, they say, well, what does this mean and why? And we get into definitions. And really the point is, if we can show what it means for people around the world, especially now where we are, we didn't talk as much about the crisis, but we are in the midst of a crisis, and especially now, we need to be focusing on systems. We can't get distracted by looking only at the urgent. As part of what we need to do with the urgent, it is actually about looking to the future and saying, how now can we be even more focused on what does it look like, both now, but also to support, actually really understand what it takes to try to change things now, and also to have systems that will work, whether it's for the 1 billion+ children that are out of school and more. So I think that's it. It's basically the biggest piece I would say is show the results, show the examples, and go from there.
That's so great, and thanks for bringing in the current context that we're in. I often, in these times, have been thinking about if we had more philanthropists who had in the past and over time supported systems change to help build up the systems that could help prevent, mitigate, and more quickly respond to the types of crisis we're in now, we might be in a different place. But instead, it seems like philanthropy, such a large part of philanthropists can be good about responding to a crisis after it happens, but not necessarily spending as much time and building up the systems to help prevent the crisis from happening in the first place. So, Sophia, the question, piece of advice for doers.
Well, it's hard to go last because there's already so much good advice there. I just agree with a lot of what's been said. I guess I would just add, I think your foundation, Tim, Chandler Foundation, is an example of, something I would say, which is, get your champions to speak up for you and help others join you. I think that's a strategy to think about. Many of you are already doing that. So not earth shattering there, but you're not in this alone. You have champions, and they can be very influential. I think the comment that people have made, you know, just bringing up the current crisis we're in, I would add as a system we need to be thinking about is the social change system itself. So even, you know, sort of lifting up from any one particular cause, you know, all systems are being strapped right now, health, education, you know, all these systems. And this is really revealing, you know, big issues with how we go about social change and how we fund it, and actually how we underfund the social entrepreneurs, the nonprofit organizations, just systemically. I mean, I will just say that. And I think donors, so I would just really speak to the donors here, have a lot to learn from how they're motivated to respond right now, which is, you know, letting go of perfectionism, loosening up restrictions, reaching out to their grantees, you know, the things that donors are doing right now. You know, I think there will be a moment of reflection in the not too distant future for donors to say, how could I be more like that all the time? How can I, you know, support nonprofits to have reserve funds, like realizing that, yeah, no one expected a global pandemic, but, you know, we need to have a stronger ecosystem for nonprofits. And so that's just a call out to donors.
Great. Thank you, Sophia, and thank you to all you panelists. You're terrific. I knew that before we started. I feel it even more confidently now. So thank you. And thanks also to the audience for your commitment to the work, whether being a donor or a doer. We need our collective strength more than ever before, as was stated earlier. And we're getting a lot of comments from people out there that they want to continue these conversations. You know, one of my experiences has been first as a doer and then as a donor in both worlds, is that it's much more common to have these conversations in groups of doers or in groups of donors, but to have it across, which I think we've accomplished today, is a good start. But I think there's, if we see appetite for more of this, we will, you'll hear back from us, and we can start more. And this is also a heads up for you panelists. I may ask you to come back. In closing here, we'd also like to encourage you to attend. There's a panel tomorrow that's co-hosted by Catalyst 2030 and Ashoka and McKinsey on embracing complexity. So it's featuring the McKinsey study on systems change. Later in April, there are going to be 2 more virtual gatherings for donors, which we hope donors in the audience will consider. You can see them on your screen. The first one is an information session about Catalyst 2030. I encourage donors to come to that just to learn more about what Catalyst 2030 is doing. It's impressive work, and you will come away, if nothing else, learning much more about systems change in the great organizations out there. There's also Co-Impact is planning a funder gathering, both for existing funders and for those who are wanting to learn more. If you're interested in that Co-Impact funding session, if you're a donor, please contact Sylvia at Co-Impact. If you're interested in learning more about the Catalyst 2030 event, you can email my colleague at the Chandler Foundation, Rose, who's our Director of Advocacy and Communications, and you'll see their contact information for both Sylvia and Rose on the slide here. We will be sending out a thank you, which includes a link to our session, so you can listen to the recording or share it with others. I think we'll, to the extent we can, be sharing information about the audience and the poll questions, the PowerPoint that you saw, maybe with the poll results in them. We are very, very grateful for all of you around the world for attending today and participating, and a shout out to the Skoll Foundation for Yeah, it's so great. I just, kudos to Dawn and the team for pivoting and moving from what is a fabulous event that is the Skoll World Forum in Oxford to what I think now maybe even more fabulous virtual event, which much more inclusive, much easier for people around the world to participate in. So thanks to the Skoll Foundation. Grateful to everyone who participated today. Thanks to all corners of the world. Stay safe and make it a good day. Thank you.